Well, good morning. Happy New Year. Yes, the first Sunday of 2019. Isn't that exciting? I'm very excited because this is the only year in a 5-year period where I don't have a kid going to college this year. So, yay, Brent, get 1 year off. But hey, who's keeping score, right? Anybody ever been on a blind date? Maybe you found your significant other on a blind date. You love blind dates, hate blind dates. Maybe you haven't. I've never been on a blind date. Didn't have anybody that cared enough to fix me up on one. No, just kidding. But I had several dates, in that whole process of people that I thought I knew, but maybe didn't really know. And so what do you end up doing? You go to dinner, you hang out a little bit, and the whole purpose of that time together is to try to figure each other out. What do they like? What do they dislike? What makes them laugh? What makes them cry? I mean, you're really trying to get to know somebody in a much deeper level. And one of the things that we typically don't use as a part of this process is a lot of metaphors. You guys understand metaphors. We're going back to, grammar class here for just a moment. But typically we don't do that to describe ourselves to one another because we're a lot more direct. But sometimes we find that in life, metaphors help us to understand. But if you're on that date and somebody were just to throw out, and instead of describing what they were like, they said, you know what, I'm a horse. And you might look at that and go, what? Okay. Because really, that description could mean a lot of different things. Well, it could mean like they're a free spirit, and they don't like it, they're like a wild horse, and they like to run free with no restrictions and limitations, and you're like, oh, that'd be cool. Or maybe they say, I'm like a workhorse, and they're like, I work really hard, which is great characteristics to have. But what if when they say I'm a horse, they mean like I eat like a horse? And I mean, that's equally important to know, right? I mean, so when we use metaphors to describe ourselves, it can be very interesting to understand what does that really mean? One of my favorite movies is Shrek. Any Shrek lovers out there? Love Shrek. There's this scene where Donkey and Shrek are talking, and Shrek says to Donkey, he says, ogres are onions. And Donkey says, they stink? And he says, no. And he says, they make people cry? He says, no. He says, you leave them out in the sun too long, they get all brown and start sprouting little white hairs? No. Shrek says, ogres are like onions because we have layers. Onions have layers, ogres have layers. We're like that. You get it? We both have layers. And Donkey says, oh, you both have layers. Oh, not everybody likes onions. Cakes, everybody loves cakes. You should be like a cake. Sometimes when it comes to getting to know people, if we're not careful, we may use terms, we may use descriptions, we may use metaphors that if we don't know where they're coming from, if we don't know the context, we get a completely twisted image in our mind that is inaccurate or incomplete of who they are. And metaphors specifically leave a lot of room for interpretation. I mean, think about it just for a moment. If I were to say right now, pick a metaphor to describe you. I am, turn to your neighbor and tell them right now. It's hard, right? You got one? I had to think on this for a little bit. I came up with this. I said, for me, I thought, I am a balloon. Right? My first thought was pretty arrogant. The first thought was really arrogant because I thought, because I rise to the top. I got a lot more groans in the first service. Then I made it very spiritual, and I thought, I'm a balloon because I rise above situations and circumstances. But then I really thought about it more, and it's pretty accurate. No, I am a balloon because mostly I'm full of hot air. But in the Gospel of John, we find Jesus using metaphors several times to describe himself. And these metaphors can give us great insight into who he was and is, and what he came to do, and how we should respond to him. But as I said, when it comes to understanding metaphors, we really have to understand the context in which they're spoken. You guys realize that this book right here, that may have been published recently, was written 2,000 years ago, roughly, or more. And the way they lived in New Testament times, I know this is going to be shocking, not like we live today. Jesus did not have an iPhone. I know, how did he even exist? But to understand when Jesus uses these descriptions to talk about himself, we need to take ourselves to a different time and place. We need to understand what the metaphor meant to the original audience. And so what we're going to do over the next 6 weeks is we're going to be in this series that we are calling I Am Jesus. Because the Gospel of John actually has 7 separate statements that Jesus makes where he says, I am something. And we want to look at this because it's important. Because what we need to understand is what is written down by the Apostle John wasn't something that John made up. John was one of the disciples. He followed Jesus around and heard Jesus teaching at various places. And later in his life, when he penned the Gospel of John, he wrote these things down that Jesus himself said. So it's not John saying, well, Jesus is like or Jesus is this. It's John writing down, oh yeah, Jesus told us he was this. And so we're going to look at 6 of these 7 statements. Now you may be saying, well, where's the 7th? What happened to it? We actually did it in the fall, in September, when we talked about in our the More You Know series, where we looked at one of the verses we thought you should know was, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So we're not going to be revisiting that one through this series, but we're going to look at the other 6 to figure out who is Jesus in his own words. And today, we're beginning with an analogy that I can really get behind. Food. I love food. I love to eat. Anybody there with me? Food, oh man. Now I realize it's a new year, and some of you have already broken your resolutions. Have started making resolutions. And you're looking to eat better and to cut out carbs or sugar, and I think all that's great. We should all try to live healthier. I can remember a year ago, I was challenged by Lynn Oswald. Some might say challenged, others might say put in a headlock by her, but either way, she was really intent on encouraging me to sign up for a gym. I was willing, after much persuasion, because I've noticed one thing as I've gotten older, certain numbers in my annual physical have changed. The waistline number had gone up. The weight number had gone up. Amazingly enough, with that, the blood pressure number had gone up. And with that, praise God for genetics, the cholesterol number was going up as well. I don't like to take pills, so I was willing to jump into this program to say, is there a way for me to get some of these things under control? What I know about me, though, is that I have a sweet tooth. Don't believe me? Join me at senior adult lunch. What table do I hit the first every time? It's Barb Ward's fault. She makes such great desserts. I love that dessert table. I have a sweet tooth. I love food. I love to eat. And I don't just eat to be sustained and live. I enjoy it. I treasure it. It's fun. It's enjoyable. But I knew if I was going to be on a program or a plan that helped me, I couldn't go around and be hungry all the time. I couldn't be hungry. I had to find some way to be filled. As I was thinking about that, I thought about, you remember those old Snicker commercials that came on? One of the lines that said, it was you're not you when you're hungry. They had Betty White playing football, and somebody came along and tackled her. You're playing football like Betty White. Here, have a Snickers. And at the end, what do they say? Snickers satisfies. I knew that I was going to have to find some satisfaction in finding a way to eat if I was going to be able to do this. Otherwise, it wasn't going to work. Otherwise, I would be picking up crumbs off my kid's plate and licking them and trying to do anything to be satisfied. To find satisfaction physically has a lot to do with what Jesus is talking about in the first I am statement that we come to in John chapter 6, where Jesus describes himself in a way that we can all relate to using food, a food that most of us, if not all of us, still eat in some portion today. And in describing himself this way, he brings to the forefront, I think, a really important question, asking, what are we hungry for? And do we find that really satisfies? In John chapter 6, we see Jesus make 3 statements in a very short period of time where he says this. It starts in John 6:35. It says, then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And then a little later in verse 48, we read this again, Jesus talking. He says, I am the bread of life. And then a few verses later in verse 51, Jesus continues by saying, I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. 3 times in this exchange, Jesus uses this expression, I am the bread of life. And what I find fascinating is if it's a very long passage, you can actually read the entire chapter, John chapter 6. It kind of captures this whole moment. But as Jesus is talking to the crowd, there's several reactions that the crowd has to him that I think many of us might be able to understand today. Because it begins with the crowd seeking Jesus. They want to find him. He's done some things, he's snuck off, and they're like, where did he go? We've got to track him down. So they're looking for him at first. And then when he begins to say, I am the bread of life, they begin to grumble about this. They begin to go, what are you talking about? We don't like this. And then they begin to argue among themselves and with Jesus. And then we find in verse 66 that something incredible happens, is that we read that many of his disciples from this time turned back and no longer followed him. So this was an important moment in his ministry. And when it says disciples there, it's not talking about the 12 disciples. It's talking about all those who had been following Jesus. And at this point, he was a pretty dynamic person to be around. He was getting crowds to follow him. But in this moment, with what he says about, I am the bread of life, Jesus draws a definitive line in the sand that many people look at and they say, I just can't go there with you. And so many turn around and stop following him. To fully grasp what Jesus is saying, we need to understand really the whole context that this is taking place in. John chapter 6 has some very big stories in the life of Jesus. It begins with Jesus feeding the 5,000. And if you know that story, it's basically this. There's a large crowd following. They're coming to hear Jesus teach. And it gets to be dinner time. And Jesus says, hey, we should feed these people. And the disciples said, how can we do that? It would take a year's salary to feed these people. We don't have any food. And one of the disciples says, oh, yes, we do. We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, which really sounds kind of stupid, to be honest. But Jesus takes this and he breaks the bread and he breaks the fish and they pass it out. And we're told in John 6 that it's 5,000 men, because they didn't count women and children. Sorry, I didn't set the rules. It's just how it was. But we know that it was probably 10 to 15,000 people that were fed that day. And they had so much food left over, they filled 12 baskets. And it says everybody had their fill. So nobody walked away hungry. Right after this, it says that the crowd was so taken with Jesus and they loved what he had done that they said, you're it. You're going to be our king. And it says they were willing to make him king by force if necessary. And Jesus knew this was not how things were supposed to go down, so he sneaks out and he kind of runs away from the crowd. And he gets by himself to pray. We read that where this took place was on the kind of close to the Sea of Galilee, and it says the disciples get in a boat and they go to the other side, about 5 or 6 miles across, I believe. While they're going across is one of these crazy miracles too, where Jesus is going to come after them, and we read about Jesus walking on the water as they get to the other side. And it's when they get to the other side that the crowd then shows up. They realize Jesus was missing, and they're like, where did he go? So they themselves walk around the lake to get to him, and that's where we kind of begin this story. One other significant point about this is that it tells us that all this is taking place around the time of Passover. Passover was a festival that the Jewish people celebrated every year. It was a time of remembering an incredible act of God when God delivered the Jewish people from the Egyptians. And he did so in a miraculous way. And so every year they celebrated Passover. If you've never done this, even as a Christian, I encourage you. It's a wonderful celebration with many symbols and images that incredibly point to Christ. But God rescued the Israelites from Egypt, and so they remembered this every year. Part of that remembrance was that when God led them out of Egypt, that night where they were about to leave the next morning, they were told, don't leaven your bread. Don't put any yeast in your bread. You're going to be leaving in such a hurry that you don't have time to let it rise. And so they made the unleavened bread, which is kind of part of this story and understanding. The other significant part is a little bit later when Jesus is talking with the crowd. They bring up this Exodus story. They bring up Moses and they remind Jesus, as if he didn't remember already, that Moses led them through the wilderness, and for 40 years as they wandered, God did a miraculous thing in the wilderness. They got hungry, they needed food, they complained, as they always did, and God miraculously brought to them what was called manna, basically bread on the ground. In the morning, they would wake up, and it would be flakes like dew on the ground. They would take a basket out, and they would collect enough for their family for that day, and they would have their provisions for what they needed. They would be given bread every day to survive. So I tell you all that because really we need to understand the context behind what Jesus is saying in this moment. It's Passover. These people are thinking about Passover and they're thinking about Moses. And Jesus makes this incredible statement that I am the bread of life. When the people find Jesus that day, before he says, I am the bread of life, I want to read this verse to you, these verses to you. They find him and they ask him this question. It says, when they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? And Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I perform, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Jesus, coming off that incredible miracle where he's provided bread for everybody, they're coming to him and they're looking, and they're asking, we want more bread. You gave us bread, we want more bread, give us more bread. They've just feasted on that. You see, they knew what it was like to be hungry physically, and they didn't want that feeling ever again. They wanted Jesus to fix that for them again, and so they were willing to track him down. Now, I realize for us in our carb-hating, Atkins-following, keto dieting world, carbs are such a no-no. But bread, for many people around the world, is still a basic of life. It's what most of the world eats, except Americans, evidently, because we think it's bad. I still love it. Carrie used to have a sourdough starter where occasionally she'd make rolls out of that. There is just nothing better than that. But when Jesus throws this out there, that he says, I am the bread of life, he's speaking in an analogy that everybody can understand. Because, especially to his audience then, they understood what it meant to be hungry. They knew what it was like to go without. Now, I have to admit, I can't relate to that. I doubt any of us can. I have seen poverty. I've been to third world countries where people live on one meal a day that consists of rice and maybe a chicken they just slaughtered outside. But I don't know what it's like to be hungry. In fact, I can remember several months ago, we have these message community meetings in my office every Monday at 10 o'clock. It was me and Ryan and Amy and Stephen. Pastor Stephen remembers from Liberia. And one of us, I don't remember who, made the comment. You remember this, Amy? And one of us said, man, I'm starving. And Stephen just kind of looked and he says, that means something completely different here than it does where I'm from. You Americans are kind of interesting with the way you throw that around. You really don't know what starving is. And it was he was very gracious about it. He wasn't hateful at all. But it made all of us kind of go, you're right. When Jesus says, I am the bread, he's using an analogy that everybody worldwide can relate to. If you're hungry, you are looking for something that will sustain you. Something that will give you energy, something that will give you what you need in that moment. And by using the analogy of bread, Jesus is reminding us that all of us are created with an innate hunger within us. Physically, yes. One of the things when I started this program a year ago, they said, we encourage you to eat 6 times a day. Smaller meals, 6 times a day. I'm going to tell you, 10 o'clock is my second meal of the day. I can tell because I have regulated my body to know that about every 3 hours I need a little snack. When I get to that place, my body tells me My stomach rumbles. I can feel the hunger pangs right here. And we can. We have that built within our physical selves. But you know, it's not just a physical reaction. We also have a spiritual hunger that we were created with. That in the beginning, that hunger was satisfied because we lived in perfect communion and perfect relationship with God. But sin came in and destroyed that. And when that happened, we had this vacuum in our lives. And Jesus saying He's the bread, He's saying, look, spiritually, you have a need. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times, instead of recognizing that hunger, we've learned to ignore it. But we are created with what some people have called to or referred to as a God-shaped hole in our lives. I found a quote from Blaise Pascal. Do you guys know him? Famous French mathematician from the 1600s. Listen to what he wrote. In the 1600s, he wrote this. He says, "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God Himself." He's saying we have this drive and this desire within us. We are looking for something to sustain our lives. And Jesus saying, "I am the bread," He's saying, hey, it's right here. I am what can sustain you. But I'm the only thing that will be able to sustain you. And when Jesus describes Himself as bread, it reminds us that we have an innate hunger within that can only be satisfied by God. Unfortunately, the people Jesus was talking to, and us today, we're not typically satisfied with that response. Because I think we always look for something else. As Pascal said in that quote, we're always looking for things around us to be able to fill that void, to fill us up, to sustain us. And so we're willing to settle for substitutes, thinking that what we can find on our own will give us what we're after. As Jesus is interacting with the crowd in that moment, they're the ones that bring up the Exodus. They talk to Him about Egypt, and they remind Him that God provided for the people to survive until they could get to the promised land. They said to Him this. They said, "Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, He gave them bread to eat from heaven to eat." And then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." You see the comparison that Jesus is drawing? See, they were thinking back to the Exodus, and they're saying, "Oh, bread fell from heaven, and that's the heavenly bread." And Jesus says, "No, no, no. I am the heavenly bread. I am the one that comes from heaven." And you need to understand the difference, because think about it for a moment. What happened to the people who ate the manna? They eventually died. There was no eternal life, everlasting life found in the bread that was provided to the people in the wilderness. And Jesus says, "But I am the bread that can give you life so that you will live forever." And as Jesus talks about these two things, He's pointing out, He says, yes, you're looking, you think what you want and need is that bread falling from heaven. And you're right in a sense, but it's not the manna you want. It is me you want, because I will satisfy. Because only the true bread from heaven can give you what you really need. You see, those substitutes that we look to sometimes may be in our jobs or in our relationships. And when you're looking for love and you find it in another human being, it feels amazing. Or you find that job that brings you fulfillment and you think you found what you wanted to do your whole life. Every day is good. Or when you take that vacation, you buy that house, you have the family, you build that nest egg. These are all things that at least temporarily make us feel really good. Or maybe things aren't so good, but we're still looking for that spiritual hole to be filled, and so we find ways to medicate ourselves or liquid medication that hopefully will dull the pain that we've experienced. But what happens is when we turn our attention to these substitutes, what we find is not one of them is designed for or can hold up to the pressure that we are putting on them. Think just a moment for this. If you're in a relationship, you're married, what if your spouse looked at you and said, you know what? I am looking to you for my satisfaction. Everything must come from you. Until the day I die, you have to satisfy me. Anybody signing up for that marriage? No. Because we all understand that I'm not equipped for that. I can't stand up under that pressure. That's too much. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying, is that we're looking to these substitutes to do things for us they were never designed to do. Yes, they may bring happiness, and that's great. Some of these things I've talked about, they're not inherently sinful. In fact, you could say Jesus created some of these things for our pleasure and for our enjoyment. But the vacation we take that may bring us temporary joy only brings us back to the emptiness if we've not addressed the root problem. And Jesus says, don't look to the substitute. The substitute is not where the satisfaction, it's not where it's going to be. Look to me. Because substitutes will always leave us feeling empty. Yeah, they may last for a little while. It may last for a couple of years. But eventually, nothing in this world can stand up to the pressure if we're looking for that to satisfy us. Now, I will say this. Many, if not most of us in this room are Christ followers. And I think there's a real big danger for those of us who follow Jesus to create some substitutes in our lives as well. What am I talking about? Things like Bible study, things like church activity, things like serving certain places, signing up for the Immersed Bible reading plan. We fill our lives sometimes with so much religious activity that in the process we miss what we are meant to see. Jesus did not say, "This is the bread of life." Did you catch that? Who's the bread of life? Jesus. This week is on Friday even. I was typing out this message. Occasionally I need a little break mentally, and so I pop on social media and I pulled up Twitter. I have several people I follow on Twitter just to see what profound things they might say. And this popped up on my Twitter feed Friday morning as I was typing this sermon. The original tweet said this. It said, read the Bible, memorize the Bible, speak the Bible, submit to the Bible, love the Bible, marry the Bible this year. And boy, doesn't that sound great? Man, that sounds so spiritual. But then somebody else I followed responded with this. This kind of language is problematic. The applications are actually good. Reading, memorizing, meditating on Scripture is good. But those practices should lead us to love, marry, submit to Christ. Scripture is always a means to an end, which is Christ. Our church attendance, as much as I love you guys being here, is not a substitute for Jesus Christ. I want everybody in this room to do the Immersed Bible reading plan with us, and us all read that together. That is not a substitute for Jesus Christ. Jesus was very clear when he made this statement that he's not saying, find something else, find the good religious things to do. He said, I am the bread of life. And only Jesus will do for us what we need. He will satisfy. He will sustain. Are we settling for substitutes in our life? Are we settling for substitutes in our relationship with Jesus. Fake bread, substitutes will always leave us empty, wanting, unfulfilled, whereas the true bread gives us life. There's one other thing I think that I really appreciate about Jesus talking about, I am the bread of life. And it's just simply this. It's an idea that comes with bread. And it's specifically found in the phrase breaking bread. We use that expression not often. It's more of an antiquated expression maybe. But when we talk about breaking bread, how do you do that? It means eating, right? Do you typically break bread alone? Not usually. When we talk about breaking bread, it reminds us that we need one another, that we need community. And when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, it reminds us that we need support. Doing this together, and bread is something that brings us together. You know, we say this all the time around here because it's true. It's our mission statement. We say we exist to connect people to Jesus, one another in our community, because we know how critical it is. And when Jesus says, I am the bread, he is reminding us that we don't consume Jesus alone. That we need to be talking about this with one another. We need to be sharing what is taking place in our lives with one another. And we can do that in our discipleship groups, in our Sunday school groups, in reading groups to discuss our immerse readings each week. Jesus is the bread of life, but it's meant to be shared in communally, to help us live and love as Jesus did. We have to move beyond the individualistic idea that being a Christ follower is something I can do by myself. It is not. And when Jesus says, I am the bread, it is an incredible reminder to us that we don't eat bread alone. We need to eat it in community with one another. Imagine what can take place when you sit down across the table over a meal with somebody else and they say, can I share with you what I learned, what I experienced of Jesus this last week? You know what happens? That person grows by telling, and you grow by hearing. And the result is two people or more, whoever's around the table, growing and transforming and becoming more like Jesus because we took the time to not try to do this on our own, but to do what Jesus said in community with one another. There's so much more I could say about this. This, like I said, it's John chapter 6. It's like 70 verses. I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's a wonderful passage, a wonderful interaction with Jesus. Jesus goes on to talk us in an entire teaching where at the end he talks about, if you want to follow me, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And this is a crazy thing to say to Jewish people who would never have done such a thing. But we find that it repulses the crowd, and what he's doing is he's highlighting for the people that we don't get to dabble in Jesus. We don't get to just take a little taste of him here and now and then. What Jesus is saying is that following him is an all or nothing proposition. And when he said this to his disciples look at him and they say, this is a hard teaching, Jesus. Who can accept this? And that's where we get to that verse where it says, and many walked away from following him that day. Like I said, this was the line in the sand moment. Jesus is saying, look, you're going to be tempted in your life to find life in so many different places, and you're going to be disappointed. And he's not saying this because he wants to kill our fun and he doesn't want us to experience life. He's saying, no, I know what the substitutes are. I know what's out there. I know what will be pulling you. And I know the end result is nothing but empty calories. Come and find something that will fill you and sustain you and satisfy you completely. And that can only be found in Jesus. You see, back then, many people were following because they thought, man, he can do some cool tricks, and he could. I'd have loved to have seen that walk on water bit. That's awesome. The bread and fish thing, how did he do that? But Jesus knew that there were many that were following just for the tricks. And Jesus is saying it matters less what I can do for you than who I am. Because the most important thing for us to understand is who he is. The one who's come, the bread from heaven, to give us life. And as I thought about this week, I wondered, are we hungry enough? Do we have a hunger for Jesus? As I said earlier, asking the question, how many of us have been hungry? None. I mean, we miss a meal and we think, I'm starving. We don't have any idea what it's like to be really hungry. We've got churches on every corner. We've got Christian bookstores down the street. We've got access to any and every resource we could possibly imagine to make us a Christian. But filling ourselves with these things is not a guarantee to find the bread and find life. Jesus says to the people, because they ask him, they say, so what can we do to get this bread? How do we order this? And he says, it's not complicated, but it is difficult. Believe. Believe. It's not a mental assent. It's not a belief that, 2 + 2 = 4. But it's a belief and believing in such a way that it radically reorients our lives. We aren't able to wake up tomorrow and live like we did today because this belief in Jesus has changed us. How is that possible? How can a belief change your life? It can change your life not because the belief, but it's the power in the one in whom you've believed. That's how it changes you. And the question I have for us today is, do we believe? Do you believe in Jesus? Or have we placed our trust in something else? Have we placed our trust in ourselves, your family, your job, your checkbook? Are you trusting in a prayer that you prayed one time, a long time ago? Are you trusting in a day where you got wet and called it baptism? Are you trusting in those events, or are you trusting in Jesus? There's a difference. What we have to learn to do this year is to consume Jesus. Every day, consume Jesus. As you think about this message where Jesus says, I'm in the bread of life, and then you jump back to where Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray. He tells them what? Give us this day our daily bread. Yep, physical needs. But man, what if Jesus in that moment wasn't just talking about the physical needs? And that when he prayed, give us this day our daily bread, when he taught his disciples and said, this is how you should pray, when they understood and they went, oh, am I getting my daily dose of Jesus? Am I consuming Jesus every day? It's a big difference. We need to make sure we're doing that. When we consume Jesus and we're filled up with him, something incredible can happen to us. I've been to third world countries and I've seen poverty. And every time I come back and I'm frustrated because I go and I think I want to do something about that. When we are filled up with Jesus, when we consume Jesus every day, you know what will happen? We'll look around, and not in a judgmental, angry way, but in a very compassionate way. And we'll see those around us that aren't filled with Jesus, that are looking to the substitutes to find life. And we'll look at them and we'll say, you know what I need to do? I need to share my bread with them. I need to help alleviate spiritual poverty in this world, and I will do so because I don't want anyone else to starve. But we can't get there unless our diet consists of a daily dose of Jesus, the bread of life. Snickers had it right. You're not you when you're hungry, and that's true. But they missed it on what truly satisfies, because it's not a Snickers, it's actually Jesus. And the question I close with today is, have you tasted the bread of life? Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Today we're going to close our service this way. I'm going to ask Jody to go ahead and come. the first Sunday of the month and we observe communion, and I could think of no better way to end this sermon than for us to come to the table, take the bread and take the juice. Because when Jesus said, I am the bread of life, it was before he had the Last Supper, it was before the crucifixion, it was before the resurrection. But I can't help but think if in that moment, when Jesus is in the upper room with the disciples, if they didn't happen to have that thought, oh, I remember Jesus said he was the bread. And now here's this broken bread, and he says, this is my body. This all has to tie in together. And you know what? Jesus said, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you can't follow me. You're not one of mine. All these things had to be flooding back to the disciples' minds in that moment in the upper room. I love that Jesus left us this picture where we come to the table and we take the bread and we remember his broken body. We take the juice, we remember his shed blood. We don't believe that these elements have any special mystical power. But what we do, in saying that though, I want to caution us. We can't reduce this to where it's just nothing but drinking gluten or eating gluten-free bread things and grape juice. There is a real significance to what we do here. It's very important that we remember the incredible sacrifice that Jesus made.